April 2026, Pretoria, South Africa. Let's start right here, right now, because what is happening on the ground right now is the reason this video exists. Hundreds of people are marching through the streets of one of the most significant cities in Africa, heading towards the Union Buildings. That is the official seat of the South African government. They are not marching for better wages. They are not marching for clean water or electricity or housing. They are marching to demand that Africans be removed from Africa. The march is being led by a movement called March and March. Its members are wearing t-shirts with the group's name. Some are carrying what are described as sticks. And one of the placards being carried through those streets reads, "March and March until we win." If fighting for my country means I am xenophobic, then I am proudly xenophobic. Read that again, not quietly, not as fringe position, on a placard in a march in the capital city, proudly xenophobic.
Foreign national shops in parts of Soweto has thrown open the issue of xenophobia once again. Now, police say members of the community were allegedly closed shops owned by foreigners.
Around the route of the march, businesses are closed, not because of a government shutdown, not because of load shedding, because their owners, many of them African migrants who have built those businesses over the years of work, are afraid of what might happen if they stay open. Shop fronts locked, shutters down. People inside hoping the crowd would pass without stopping. A Nigerian man named Chukwidu Ajoku, who works as a security officer in South Africa legally, told BBC reporters that he could not go to work that day. He said something that should stop you. Imagine being scared in your own African continent. What if we go to Europe? How would we feel? He's a security guard. His job is to make things safe, and he could not leave his house. Ghana's High Commission issued a formal advisory, not a recommendation, a formal advisory telling Ghanaian nationals to close their businesses for the day.
Ghana High Commission in Pretoria is urging Ghanaian residents to avoid traveling to the Johannesburg Central Business District on Wednesday amid heightened tensions and protests against foreign nationals. In a statement released today, the High Commission said the demonstration is already affecting normal business activity in the Central Business District, with an increased risk of hostility, particularly towards foreign nationals. The Commission is further advising community members in Johannesburg to stay indoors or remain in secure locations and to limit unnecessary movement.
To avoid areas where the demonstrations were taking place, to keep a low profile, to avoid posting anything on social media that could be interpreted as provocative, to not engage in public gatherings. This is what the government tells its citizens when they are in danger. Nigeria's Diaspora Commission issued similar warnings. The Nigerian Union chairman in South Africa told his members to close their shops, stay indoors and not go outside. And the march in Pretoria on Tuesday was not the only one. Another was planned in Johannesburg on Wednesday. A further protest was scheduled in Mthatha on 11 May, the first anti-immigration march in that area in over 30 years. But here is what puts all of this in context. 2 Nigerians were already dead before any of this week's march started. The chairman of the Nigerian Union in South Africa, Olaniyi Abodedele, confirmed their names: Calvin Jidibere and Amara Muriel, and Ekpenyong Andrew. Andrew died on Sunday, 19 April, in Pretoria West. He had been detained by officials who did not tell him what his offense was. According to the community leader, he was beaten and his body was dumped at a hospital. Amara Muriel was visited at his home by police and military on 20 April, beaten, locked in jail. He was bailed on 22nd April. He went home feeling better. He went back to hospital on Thursday. He was told he had internal bleeding. He died on Friday, 24th April. Both men are dead. No security operative had, as of the time of the reporting, reacted to those allegations. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned the situation. He called the attacks criminal acts perpetrated by individuals inciting violence and exploiting socio-economic conditions. He reminded South Africans of how the anti-apartheid struggle was sustained through international and African solidarity. He said violence, vigilantism, and all forms of incitement to hatred have no place in an inclusive democratic society. Good statement. 2 men are still dead. This is the present moment. This is the street. And now the question we are going to spend the rest of this video answering is, how did we get here? And who is responsible for the fact that we keep arriving at the same place? Before we get into the conflict itself, let's understand who we are actually talking about, because this story gets told in a way that flattens both sides into caricatures, and if we are going to understand it properly, we need to see both communities clearly. Let's start with the Nigerian presence in South Africa. South Africa is a home to a substantial Nigerian diaspora community. Most of them are working, many are running businesses, operating in the informal sector, contributing to local economies in ways that do not show up in the official statistics but are visible on each and every high street and in every informal market in the country's major cities. The Nigerian Union of South Africa is a formal representative body. The Igbo Union South Africa is another. These are not ad hoc groupings. They are not organized communities with spokespeople, governance structures, and decades of institutional history in the country. Nigerian migrants in South Africa are not a monolith. Some are undocumented, some have overstayed visas, some are involved in criminal activities. These facts are true, and we will deal with them honestly later in this video, but the majority are people who came in South Africa to build something and who have done exactly that within a legal framework across years and in some cases decades. And here is the historical fact that anchors this entire story. Nigeria is not just any country to South Africa. When South Africa was under apartheid, and when the African National Congress was banned, when Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island, when the liberation movement was fighting with whatever resources the international community was willing to provide, Nigeria showed up. Nelson Mandela acknowledged this directly and specifically. He said Nigeria made a very significant contribution to the struggle against apartheid, not a passing acknowledgement, a direct named tribute. The Igbo Union South Africa cited this in their 2026 statement, describing Nigeria as a frontline state in the South Africa's liberation struggle. They are right. Nigeria provided political backing through the Organization of African Unity. It provided financial support to the ANC in exile. It was diplomatically engaged in the international campaign to isolate the apartheid regime. That support came with real costs and real commitments. That history is the foundation of what makes the current violence feel not just brutal but specifically and historically wrong. It is not just Africans attacking Africans, it is a country attacking the nationals of the country that helped free it. Now let's look at the South African side, because the picture there is just as specific and just as important. The South African unemployment rate sits at approximately 33%. That is one of the highest rates in the world. For young South Africans, the rate is significantly higher. The country inherited from apartheid not just a political system that needed dismantling, but an economic structure built entirely on the extraction of value from black South Africans, one that created a small wealthy class and a massive poor majority. 30 years of democracy have not reversed that structure. The inequality gap remains among the widest on the planet. Public services are under severe strain. Housing shortages are acute. Healthcare and education systems serve far more people than they were designed for, and into all of that pressure, into 30 years of delivery that has not matched the promise of 1994, South Africans have been told repeatedly and by politicians that the people in the informal markets and the township shops are the reason their lives are not better. South Africa is home to approximately 2.4 million migrants. This is just under 4% of the population according to the official figures. Most come from neighboring countries like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, countries with deep historical ties to South Africa and long traditions of providing migrant labor. A small number come from further afield, including Nigeria. The unofficial numbers are high because undocumented migration is by definition not fully counted. A study co-authored by the Human Sciences Research Council and the Institute for Security Studies found that 80% of South Africans supported stronger government efforts to control undocumented migration. 65% supported forced repatriation. These are not fringed positions. They reflect a majority view in a country under genuine economic pressure, held by people who have been given one specific explanation for their circumstances and have not been offered a more accurate alternative. Both of those communities are real. Both of their experiences are real, and the collision between them, which has been building for 30 years and which erupted again in April 2026, is what this video is about. Among all the millions of migrants in South Africa, Nigerians have attracted a disproportionate and particularly intense form of hostility. Understanding why requires understanding how a narrative gets built and what happens when nobody challenges it with evidence. The story about Nigerians in South Africa was constructed in the mid-1990s through political speech that was never substantiated by data. Here is the documented record. In 1997, a National Party spokesperson on Home Affairs named Frick van Deventer stated in an interview that Nigerians had entered the country in droves since 1994 and that 80% of all drug suspects appearing in Johannesburg courts were Nigerian. He used this to argue for harder immigration policies and to blame the ANC for accommodating its solidarity partners from the liberation era. In the same period, a police captain gave a press interview stating that he believed as many as 90% of Nigerians in South Africa seeking asylum status were involved in the drug trade. Neither of those figures were supported by any credible, nationwide, independently verified data. Human Rights Watch, conducting research in South Africa at the time, could not find no empirical foundation for these claims in court record and official statistics. They were political statements made by political actors with political motivations, and they were printed and repeated and taken as fact. By the time they had circulated for a decade, they were no longer claims, they were assumptions. By the time they had circulated for 2 decades, they were cultural knowledge. By 2026, a Nigerian security officer named Chikudu Ajoku had to tell the BBC reporter on camera, "I am Nigerian, I do not commit any crime, I am proud of my job." He is a legal worker. He has never been charged with anything, and he has to say that out loud because 30 years of unchallenged political rhetoric has made his existence something that requires a defense. The chairman of the Nigerian Union of South Africa, Olaniyi Abodedele, said it plainly: "As long as you are Nigerian, you are profiled and you are stereotyped immediately." He added, "I have been harassed. For us, it is not about whether you are legal or not. Everyone is profiled, and the 2 dead men are the endpoint of that 30-year narrative. Kelvin, Chidiebere Amamiru, and Ekpanyo Andrew are what happens when a stereotype becomes a policy posture, because a police attitude becomes a cell, becomes a hospital, a stereotype that was never true and was never challenged. Their names should not be forgotten." This is the hardest section to write because it requires doing something that gets lost in the noise of this debate, taking the grievance seriously without endorsing the violence it produces. South Africa has an unemployment rate of 33% for young black South Africans between 15 and 34. The rate is substantially higher. The structural inequality that apartheid created did not dissolve in 1994. The racial wealth gap is amongst the widest on the planet. People who are poor in South Africa today are overwhelmingly the descendants of people who were deliberately kept poor by the explicit government policy for generations. The country is 30 years into trying to undo that. It has not yet finished, and many people are not sure it will ever will. In 1995, the Southern African Bishops' Conference published an extensive report on perceptions of migrants in South Africa. It warned that the unrealizable expectations of the population, bolstered by the high promises of the ANC's reconstruction and development program, would soon translate into heightened xenophobia, as foreigners would be blamed for the slow progress of reform. It added, "Indeed, this has already begun." That was written in 1995, 31 years before 2026 March. The Bishops' Conference could already see exactly what was coming, and it came exactly as predicted, which means this was not unforeseeable, it was foreseen, and the political and economic responses that might have interrupted the cycle were either not implemented or were inadequate. One of the much protesters told BBC, "We were getting along well with every foreigner in this country. until they began to disrespect us as citizens and our laws. That statement deserves to be taken at face value rather than being dismissed. Something changed in the relationship, or something changed in the perception of the relationship. For a conflict this entrenched, that subjective experience of change matters, whether or not the facts behind it are accurate. President Ramaphosa acknowledged on Freedom Day that corruption exists within the immigration system. That is not a small concession. A corrupt immigration system creates real problems. It allows people to remain who should not be here through bribery rather than legal processes. It creates a perception, which may be partly accurate, that the rules are not applied fairly or consistently. That anger is real. The unemployment is real. The inequality is real. What is not real is the conclusion that the solution is to beat Nigerians to death in their homes and on their streets. The connection between the real grievance and the violent target it has been assigned is not logical. It is constructed, and understanding who constructed it and how is what we tend to next. There is a specific mechanism through which economic anxiety becomes ethnic violence. It requires a middleman. That middleman is usually a politician who has calculated that naming a target is more electorally useful than solving a problem. South Africa has had that politician in almost every era of its democracy. In 1995, Minister of Home Affairs Mangosuthu Buthelezi addressed Parliament and told the country that it could forget about its reconstruction and development program if it did not stop the flow of migrants. He said this to a population that just voted for the first time, people who had been promised reconstruction, development and a better life for all, and the Minister of Home Affairs told them in the first year of democracy that the reason the promise might not be delivered was the presence of foreigners, not corruption, not structurally inequality, not the inherited economic system of apartheid. The foreigners. In his 1997 budget speech, Buthelezi returned to this argument, presenting a calculation suggesting that if every undocumented migrant cost the infrastructure 1,000 rand annually, the total cost became billions of rands per year. A calculation built on an estimate by an assumption presented as evidence. The Freedom Front and the National Party immediately used this to call for stronger measures. The IFP threatened physical action if the government failed to respond. The National Party went further. Its spokesperson linked immigration directly to crime, disease, unemployment, and economic decay. Nigerians were specifically named as having entered in droves and dominating drug crime. These claims were made without supporting data, they were repeated without correction, and they embedded themselves in public consciousness across the decade that followed. One politician backed the trend. Mpumalanga Premier Matthews Posa spoke out against what he called neo-nationalism that could easily lead to xenophobia. He pointed to the destructive impact of apartheid on regional economies as the actual cause of refugee flows. He said any solution ignoring this reality would be superficial and would not stand a chance of succeeding. His voice was largely drowned out. That too is data. Fast forward to February 2026, Zulu King Mrs. Zulu Zwelithini used a derogatory term for foreigners and said that they should all leave South Africa. 11 years earlier, in 2015, his father King Goodwill Zwelithini said something almost identical, telling migrants to pack their belongings and go. In 2015, 7 people died in xenophobic attacks in the weeks that followed. In 2026, 2 Nigerians were dead before the marches even started. The speeches and the violence are not separate phenomena. They are part of the same process. Politicians who make unsubstantiated inflammatory statements about national communities and then express shock when their constituents act on those statements are not being honest about causation. Until South African law holds that process to account, the process will continue to run. There is a piece of this story that gets left out of almost every report on xenophobia in South Africa, and it is the piece that transforms this conflict from a story about migration and economics into something more specific, more painful, and more historically significant. Nigeria was a frontline state in the war to end apartheid. Let's be precise about what that means. During the decades that South Africa was governed by racial classification, forced segregation and land dispossession, and political imprisonment, the international community was asked to take a position. Some countries chose trade relationships over principle, some chose strategic alliances over moral consistency. Nigeria chose differently. The Nigerian government, under successive administrations, championed the cause of South African liberation through the Organization of African Union. It pushed for international sanctions against the apartheid regime. It provided financial support to African National Congress during its years in exile, and when ANC had no state resources and was dependent on the solidarity of foreign governments to survive, Nigeria made its position unambiguous and paid diplomatic costs for doing so. Nelson Mandela acknowledged this not as a generality but specifically. He said, "Nigeria made a very significant contribution to the struggle against apartheid." That sentence is in the historical record. The man who spent 27 years in prison, in part because the international community did not move fast enough, chose to name Nigeria by name as a significant contributor to the movement that eventually freed him. Igbo Union South Africa cited this history in their 2026 statement and drew the direct conclusion that legacy of solidarity should not be repaid with hostility. It is a measured statement. It could have been angrier. It is simply true. Now consider the time of what happened in the week of 2026 March. Monday, April 27th, South Africa's National Freedom Day. That day marks the first democratic elections in South Africa. The elections that happened because of 30 years of liberation struggle sustained partly by international solidarity, including Nigerian solidarity. On that day, President Ramaphosa gave an address. He reminded the country of the debt it owed to the continent that stood with it during apartheid. He condemned the recent xenophobic attacks. He said South Africans should not allow their concerns about illegal migration to breed prejudice and hatred towards fellow Africans. The next day, Tuesday, April 28th, hundreds of people marched to Pretoria with sticks demanding that Africans leave. That sequence is not ironic, it is structural. The Freedom Day speech and the Freedom Day march are not in contradiction, they are in relationship. The speech reflects a government that understands the history and has not built a political economy capable of honoring it. The march reflects a population that has been given an explanation for its suffering that history directly contradicts, and that has never been given the tools to know the difference. What Nigeria did for South Africa belongs in every South African school, in every civics class, in every political debate about migration. It is not there, and in its absence, the citizens of the country that helped free South Africa are hiding in their shops in Pretoria. Let's deal with the drug and crime argument directly, because it is the single most repeated justification for hostility towards Nigerians specifically, and it deserves a precise, evidence-based response. The claim, in its common form, Nigerians in South Africa are primarily responsible for drug trade, particularly for trafficking and dealing of hard drugs in South African cities. This is treated in public discourse as an established fact, cited to justify profiling, harassment, police operations, and in extreme cases, violence. Here is the evidentiary basis for that claim. Political statements from the 1990s, which were themselves never supported by credible nationwide data. That is the entire foundation. A National Party politician in 1987 said 80% of drug suspects in Johannesburg courts were Nigerian. A police captain said 90% of Nigerians seeking asylum were in the drug trade. Human Rights Watch, conducting research in South Africa at the time, found no empirical basis for these figures in court records or official statistics. The numbers were stated as facts, never verified, printed and repeated until they became conventional wisdom. Now, here is that part that turns the entire narrative on its head. Human Rights Watch documented that foreign nationals in South Africa are disproportionately victims of crime, not perpetrators, not because they are more vicious, but because they are more vulnerable. Foreign nationals, particularly undocumented ones, are likely to go to the police when they are victimized. Criminals know this. The documented pattern is of criminal gangs precisely because those victims will not report the crime, and the police may not investigate even if they do so. So the foreigner becomes the victim precisely because the structural vulnerability that anti-foreigner politics created makes them the easiest target in the room. Human Rights Watch documented this across the country. Somali hawkers in Kempton Park robbed repeatedly, going to the police, being told they could not be helped, stopping hawking entirely because it was not safe. A Nigerian hawker in Cape Town stepped after catching a local competitor stealing from his store, going to the police, being told there was nothing to do. The police captain who told the Somali victim, "This is not your country," the police response is not incidental, it is taught by the political culture that surrounds it. When politicians say for 30 years that foreigners are the problem, police officers learned that foreigners are not a protected constituency, and criminals land there too. The most crime vulnerable people in South Africa are being blamed for the crime they disproportionately suffer. That inversion from victim to suspect is not an accident. It is the product of a narrative built in the 1990s and never corrected with evidence. The economic argument against migrants runs like this. Foreign nationals are taking jobs from South Africans, competing unfairly in markets, and extracting value from the country without contributing to it. This argument has been made by politicians, civic organizations, and demonstrators in the streets of Pretoria. It feels intuitive in a country with 33% of unemployment, and like most intuitive economic arguments, it does not survive careful examination. Most migrants in South Africa work in the informal sector, not by choice, by necessity. The formal economy is largely inaccessible to them. To get a formal job in South Africa's regulated labor market, you generally need documentation that many migrants do not have, language skills that vary across migrant communities, and access to networks and credentials that are harder to obtain from outside the country. The 33% unemployment figure, the one cited by every anti-migrant speech, is most acute in the formal sector. That is not primarily where the migrants are operating. What migrants have done, documented by researchers and by direct testimony, is to build the informal sector, the street trading networks, the spaza shops, the mobile repair businesses, the food stalls, the cross-border trading relationships. Much of this infrastructure was developed by migrant communities, including Nigerians, over years of operating in spaces where local formal businesses had not ventured. A Nigerian trader in Cape Town gave Human Rights Watch researchers an account that captures this precisely. He described how his community developed the hawking sector in his area of the city. Then he described what happened next. He said, "At first, we were very poor, but then people started noticing that we were making money. We were progressing and having cars and such things. The local people started using our techniques and many people wanted to become traders. We developed this thing and now the local people want to kick us out. They say the influx of foreigners is taking their jobs, but we taught them how to do business." That account reflects a pattern that appears across documented history of informal trading conflicts. Foreign traders develop a sector. Local traders want access to that sector rather than competing through the market. Some local groups use violence and political pressure to remove the foreign traders and take the businesses they build. Then they describe this as reclaiming their own economy. The political argument that migration drives unemployment treats the economy as a fixed pool of jobs being distributed among a growing number of people. That is not how economies work. When someone opens a shop that did not exist before, they are not taking a job from someone else. They are creating economic activity that was not there before. A foreign-owned spaza shop in a township employs local workers. It supports goods to local residents. It pays local landlords for its premises. It is not extracting value from the community. It is circulating value within it. Violence is not a market mechanism. It is replacement of a market mechanism with force, when people using force have calculated that they cannot win through competition. And 30 years of political rhetoric has told some South Africans that force is not just permitted but patriotic. That is the real economic problem, not the migrants, the politics that decided to solve economic competition through ethnic violence. Let's give the government its due. On Freedom Day 2026, President Cyril Ramaphosa gave a speech that was, by the standard of the available political vocabulary, the right speech. He condemned the recent xenophobic attacks. He told South Africans not to allow their concerns about illegal migration to breed prejudice and hatred toward fellow Africans. He reminded the country of the continental solidarity that sustained the entire apartheid struggle. He acknowledged corruption in the immigration system and committed to rooting it out. He said the government would not allow people to take the law into their own hands. These are the correct positions. They reflect a genuine understanding of the history, and they changed almost nothing about what happened the following day or days that followed, because there is a gap between what South African government understands and what the South African government does, and that gap is the actual subject of this section. The Green Paper Task Group on International Migration, reporting to the Minister of Home Affairs in 1997, documented that the immigration system was being administered with excessive administrative discretion and that the risk of arbitrary and unconstitutional action by police and immigration officials was greatly increased by the absence of clear procedures. That was 1997, 29 years before Ramaphosa's Freedom Day speech. The acknowledgement is very old, the fix is very slow. Charles Perry, the director of the South African Medical Research Council's Alcohol and Drugs Research Unit, documented in a separate but directly relevant context that liquor executives told him directly, "You are not going to get anywhere. We have better access. We bribe with these guys." That is not a quote about immigration, but it describes the same structural reality, industry and political interests protecting each other from accountability. The mechanism is identical. The Nigerian Union of South Africa chairman Olaniyi Abodedele told the BBC something that captures the human reality of this governance failure. He said, "We are in the dark because we do not know how our government in Nigeria is going to react if any of us is affected or is killed. Let that land." A community leader in South Africa in 2026 does not know whether his government will respond if his members are killed. He is waiting, but in the dark. A Nigerian security guard who cannot go to work because a mob might attack him does not need a statement from the UN Secretary General. He needs a police force that will do its job, a government that will prosecute the people who threaten him, and a political culture that will stop generating the conditions that make those threats feel legitimate to the people making them. Ramaphosa gave the right speech. The speech is not enough. The speech has never been enough. And until the structures that produce the conditions for xenophobic violence are reformed rather than condemned, the next speech is already been written. 30 years of this cycle has produced a very clear picture of what does not work. Condemnation does not work. Statements do not work. Promises to address root causes do not work when those promises are followed by the same insufficient action. So, here is what would actually work, specifically, structurally, with names attached. First, accountability for violence. South Africa has laws against incitement to violence. Laws against assault, murder, destruction of property. These laws exist. They have been largely unenforced in the context of xenophobic violence for 30 years. The documented pattern established by Human Rights Watch and confirmed by subsequent reporting is that police advise victims of xenophobic attacks to leave rather than arresting perpetrators. That pattern must end, not with a statement, with actual prosecutions. Second, accountability for political speech. South Africa's Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act exists for exactly the kind of statements that have been made by politicians and traditional leaders in this crisis. When a king uses a derogatory term for foreigners and tells them to leave, that is not protected opinion, it is incitement. When a politician claims without evidence that the specific national group is responsible for the majority of drug crimes, that is not political debate. It is the construction of a target for violence. These statements have consequences. The law should reflect that. Third, actual immigration systems reform. Not another acknowledgement that the system is corrupt. Reform. An independent oversight mechanism with real authority, a functioning process for documenting migrants in the country, a clear, consistently applied framework for managing undocumented migration based on law, not official discretion, genuine accountability for officials who accept bribes. These reforms have been recommended in government commission reports since 1990s. They have not been implemented. Someone must be made to implement them. Fourth, the history must be taught. Mandela's acknowledgement of Nigeria's contribution to the liberation struggle belongs in South African classrooms. The history of the solidarity that sustained the anti-apartheid movement, which came from across Africa and from Nigerian hands specifically, belongs in the political conversation about migration. You cannot have an honest conversation about what South Africa owes its continental neighbors without knowing what those neighbors actually did. Right now, most of the people marching through Pretoria do not know. That is a solvable problem. It requires political will to include that history in the national story rather than letting it sit in archives. Two men named Calvin Chidiebere Amamirio and Ekpenyo Andrew are dead. They died in April 2026 in Pretoria, the capital city of a country that Nelson Mandela's freedom depended in part of Nigerian helping to win. South Africa ended apartheid once because the world refused to allow it to continue. The question for 2026 is whether South Africa and the continent and the world are willing to refuse to allow this to continue. The march needs to stop, but more than that, the conditions that produce the march need to stop. And that is a political decision that somebody with power has been refusing to make for 30 years. They need to make it now.